Week 16 of Aon's Public Affairs podcast was recorded July 22nd, 2020.
Hello and welcome to the Aon's Public Affairs podcast. Daniel Sirota, based out of Chicago, Illinois. I am excited to talk about a topic that I've been wanting to talk about, which is one of my biggest hobbies, which is sports, with Bob Dupay, who is currently a partner at Foley & Lardner, but used to be the former president and COO of Major League Baseball. Mr. Dupay, welcome to the podcast.
Dan, it's great to be with you, and what great timing, given that we're kicking off the season tomorrow.
Well, we're kicking off the season tomorrow, and I wanted to try to dig in first at talking about, overall, how has Major League Baseball in the sports industry adjusted to, state regulation around COVID?
Well, like many industries, it has been extremely complicated and difficult, particularly given the fluidity of the situation and ever-evolving regulations and mandates. And each sport has its own complications and some advantages. For example, baseball, like golf, is a little bit less contact than football and basketball. And so the health and safety concerns are not quite as much. But basketball and hockey, for example, are going to finish their seasons in a bubble. And so they only have to really deal with the one location or two locations and the state mandates. With baseball, you have to worry about, and football, you've got to worry about travel, you've got to worry about hotels, and you've got in the case of baseball, two countries, I think 18 states and 28 different cities, each of whom have regulations. You saw that Washington struggled a little bit to get to play their games at home, and Toronto can't play their games at home and are going to play most of their games in Pittsburgh. So it's been very complicated, but it's complicated for everybody. You have to think about everything you do now rather than do everything instinctively. And so I think the sports are leading the way in trying to get back in a safe but somewhat normal fashion, albeit without fans in the stands.
Well, and that gets me to, I think, a very important point, which, look, we're going to have no fans in the stands, no concession sales. Ticket sales are going to go down. Players are still going to be collecting their salaries and getting paid. How does Major League Baseball and, other sports, continue to thrive in the long term?
Well, I think for a little bit until we get through this and people are more comfortable in attending large public gatherings, for a little bit, it will be a challenge and a complication. But baseball has the advantage of 30 years ago, about 60 to 65% of the revenue of teams was based on stadium-based revenue, whether it be ticket sales or parking or concessions or merchandise or in-stadium signage. Now it's flipped, and about 60% of the revenue is broadcast rights. And as you know, particularly in baseball, the local broadcast rights are significant for teams, and national money, the money that comes from the internet and the money that comes from MLB Network and the various national sponsorships. So while it will be significant and the losses will be dramatic, at least there's the broadcast money that will hopefully carry the sport until we get back to a sense of normalcy.
And, one of the big things within Aon, we have clients, as I told you is like big, medium, and small that do a lot of sponsorships in the industry. How do you think overall that's going to be impacted?
Short term, as you've seen on the broadcast media, there have been a number of sponsors that have cut down on their media buys, given that their businesses have been cut down. The entertainment and the restaurants and the food industry, the airline industry, even the automotive industry have all cut back on their at least broadcast sponsorships for a time. In baseball, you have the opportunity, for example, of in-stadium sponsorships, which I think will increase because there won't be fans to watch. So you might as well be able to see what is going on. And I think some teams will be clever with their rotating signage and their interactive signage in the various ballparks. I also think that, again, radio will be an important part of baseball's broadcasting exposure over the next year or so. And then more, I think, promotional activities and actual sponsored activities where a sponsor will hook up with a team or with the league to provide something with regard to the playoffs or something with regard to the World Series. And so I think, again, creative people will be able to come up with ways to get their message out. And what better way to do it? The country is, as you know, starved for live sports. And we're lucky that we're going to have baseball start this week. Basketball is going to start finishing their season next week. And before long, we'll be with the NFL training camps based on the various discussions they've had. It would appear that their training camps are going to open. So I think you're going to see a rush to live broadcasting over the next 3 or 4 weeks while people start to get back into live sports.
You have no idea how excited I am to get baseball back, and basketball and football. I mean, it's been a long run, and, I am interested to see how that plays out. And especially, I'm somebody that's an ESPN fanatic, and seeing the replays of what has happened in the past is getting old. So I cannot wait.
It was nice to see an exhibition game. Go see the White Sox and Cubs the other day. It does take a little bit of getting used to with regard to the empty ballparks. But golf has managed fairly well, I think, to present their product. And the players are practicing, for the most part, safe and social distancing. And they've had a pretty good experience with their tournament so far. And I think the sports that involve a little bit more physical contact, like baseball and like basketball, are going to have to adjust. But I think they'll be able to do so.
And, you brought up an interesting point, and, the relationship between the associations as well as the players' unions. Football, we've seen something a little bit more public around a little bit dispute of safety and other things. Baseball, there's been a different back and forth about how reopenings take fold. How do you think overall, what are some lessons that could be learned from this, from these times on the relationship between the players' union and the associations?
Well, I don't have time to go through the tortured labor history of MLB and its union, but as you know, knowing the game, for 25 years, there was no labor deal without a work stoppage of some fashion. And there were many improvements, free agency. I mean, the game is better as a result of those disputes, but it left a lot of scars. And we've now had 25 years, again, of labor peace, beginning in 1996. But this year has been particularly complicated, obviously, without having the season start on time or even close to on time. I think the players justifiably were concerned that they were the ones who were taking the most significant risk in terms of the health factor by going out on the field and by traveling and by being part of the game. The owners, on the other hand, I think were justifiably concerned that they were the ones bearing the economic risk. And even the small market teams are talking about losses that are approaching 8 figures at the very least this year. So, that led to a fair amount of tension with regard to how many games were going to be played and under what circumstances, and what would happen if one or more players or participants, umpires, came down with the virus, and how to deal with that. And a lot of that was done sort of publicly and through the newspaper, and it was not particularly seemly. But I think once they get back on the field, those tensions will melt away and everybody will be focused on the championship season. The problem going forward, however, Dan, is that the collective bargaining agreement expires next year. And each of the parties is going to go into that negotiation wanting to get back what they've sacrificed or lost this year. And to some extent, it is a zero-sum game with regard to the amount of money, that will be generated. And so I expect that for, unfortunately, the first time in over 2 decades, the labor negotiations next year will be reasonably contentious. And you saw that a little bit with the NFL over the last week or two when the players started to focus on their personal safety and getting down in the trenches and having to go home at night and having to travel, and what that was going to mean with regard to their season. The NBA faced that maybe a month and a half ago when they talked about the bubble. And it's remarkable that their testing has been as good. The bubble has worked so far as exactly as they had hoped. And while again, that won't give the home fans the chance, to have the playoffs in their home arenas, they're going to have to watch it on television anyway. And so that's sort of a, not quite as large a detriment. But with baseball, where you're playing 60 times 900 games, you couldn't do that in a single venue. So I think the sports are trying. I think the players are trying. I understand their concerns about their family and about their parents and about their grandparents and about their kids. And similarly, I have some sympathy for the owners who are writing the checks and are not going to see ticket revenue and are not going to see stadium-related revenue. It's a difficult situation, and I think they're trying their best.
And, I think it will be very interesting to see how this go. And, Major League Baseball as a whole, national pastime for over 100 years, and I think one of the key things is how, and I'd be interested in your take, and what and how are they reaching out to create this next generation of fans? Because this is a unique time. This is going to be interesting. How are we going to get those next generations to, enjoy and watch baseball for the long haul?
Yeah, I think, let me again put that in context. When I was still at baseball as the president COO, people used to ask me what was the best part of my job. And clearly getting good seats was the best part of my job. But really the best part of my job was at every World Series game, I walked around and gave out 24 balls to kids. And it had to be kids. Parents would say, oh, I'll bring it home to my kid. But it had to be kids. And you would hand a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old a World Series ball, and they would look at the ball and you knew you had a fan for life. And when I would go around and speak to various groups, I used to talk about all the great things there were about baseball. And there were, again, we don't have the time, but there are lots of wonderful things. And then I would end with talking about what the short term and the medium term and the long term challenges were for the sport. And in my view, there was really only one long term challenge, and that was how to relate to the next generation of fans. I am old enough to remember that when I was a kid, boxing, horse racing, and baseball were the three major sports in America in the mid 50s until the NFL sort of took off, and then the NBA. I mean, it's only, I guess, 25 years ago that the NBA finals were shown on tape delay after the news. And what's happened with that is just a remarkably wonderful story of a sport capturing the imagination of the American public. And horse racing and boxing, as you know, are sort of not what they were. And the question is, how do you prevent baseball from doing that? And it's why we spend as much time, money, and effort on MLB.com as we did, because I think that is clearly best of breed. And in terms of appealing to the next generation, I think is a truly an important product. Again, MLB is trying. One of the things I could have mentioned when you were talking about dealing with regulations and the impact is the devastating impact this has had on minor league baseball, because minor league baseball, in fact, does make its revenue from attendance. They don't have broadcast revenue to speak of, and they don't have quite as much sponsorship revenue. And so they're not having a season. And, that's 40 million fans who are devoted and who view it as family entertainment, who are missing out on that this year. And, focusing on what minor league baseball does and transferring that to the major league level, making the game more interactive in terms of youth and in terms of appeal, picking up the pace of the game. And it really isn't as much time as it is pace. When you're watching on television, it's different when you're there in person. You can watch the third base coach, you can watch the umpires, you can watch what's going on in the dugout. But when you're watching on TV, there's an element of let's move the game along. And I think they're trying to do that. And finally, making our young stars more appealing, or getting them out in front of our fans earlier in their careers, I think is critical. Again, football and basketball have the advantage of most of these kids come up through high school and college and people know who they are and they immediately go into the NFL or they immediately go into the NBA. With Major League Baseball, they generally take 2 or 3 years to get through the minor league system and to get up into Major League Baseball. And we've got to figure out a way to solve for that. So it is clearly on the front of Rob Manfred's plate and the others at MLB. And I think you'll see a number of changes to address exactly what you're talking about over the next few years.
Well, that's good to hear. And I am somebody that grew up a baseball fan for my entire career, used to go to Cubs games with my dad all the time. And it's exciting to see, the MLB and others are thinking about, how to get and reach to those next generation of fans. Because I do think it's an important part, especially when we're thinking about COVID, energizing sports to that point. So, Mr. Dupay, I got to end my last question. Who do you got? Who's going to win? Who's going to bring it home?
Well, everybody likes the Dodgers and the Yankees, and I can understand why they do, given their lineups and given what they've spent on players and given what they've acquired. But with 60 games, you really have to wonder how all that's going to break out. And I think the teams that have 2 or 3 strong starting pitchers, if they stay healthy over the course of 60 games may have an advantage. So I think, the Nationals with Strasburg and Scherzer and Corbin are in awfully good shape. And if the Mets, they can never seem to stay healthy, but if the Mets could stay healthy, I think they could give the teams a tussle. And if you look at the interleague schedule this year, with the exception of the Yankees, the American League East is not particularly strong from top to bottom. And that will be the teams that, the Nationals and the Mets will be playing in interleague play. And so they may be able to pick up some games in hand with that. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the Nationals back in the World Series.
Okay. Don't sleep on the Cubs. The big Chicago team. Don't sleep on them, Mr. Dupay.
I will not. But, I've got the Brewers. I spent 25 years in Milwaukee, and we got the Brewers 90 miles north of there. And, as 2 years ago, Yelich carried that team on his back for half the season. So if he can do it for 60 games, they could be a problem too.
Yeah, don't sleep on the Cubbies. That's all I'm going to tell you. They're going to come sneaking in there. And I agree with the lineups. I think pitching is going to be a big part, especially with the adjusted schedule. Having two solid pitchers will be important. Well, look, Mr. Dupay, thank you for coming onto the podcast. Appreciate your leadership and your support to the sports industry. I know you are well known and well respected in this industry, and I thank you for your time on coming on.
Well, thank you, Dan. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for the kind words, and good luck to you and everyone at AN and all of your clients.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining. We are expanding. This week we'll be on different platforms, so please do click subscribe on the link below, and we look forward to having you join next week, week 17. Thanks so much.
This information is a resource for Aon clients and business partners. It is intended to provide general guidance of potential exposures and is not intended to provide legal, regulatory, or medical advice. Due to the dynamic nature of infectious diseases, Aon cannot be held liable for the guidance provided. We encourage listeners to seek additional information from credible sources. Thank you.